I'm going to start with a look at advanced funnel analysis, and really this harkens back to sort of the early days of web analytics. I think that when we first started doing web analytics, looking at funnels was probably the signature web analytics technique. When Omniture and Website Story went out and sold people on this kind of software, largely what they sold them on was the ability to look at people moving through their conversion funnels and looking at drop-off. And they would often point to substantial improvements in conversion performance and say, if you really knew where people dropped off in your forms, you could improve your forms and you'd substantially improve your business. Which all at the time made a certain amount of sense. We'll talk about why it probably doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. Like most of the other techniques that I've talked about, and most of the techniques that are in this deck, conversion funnel really focuses on how well the site works. It's another look at the website as a tool, but it's a very constrained look, looking just at operational processes that are involved in moving people from one point to another. You know, I think that one of the questions that these days you will sometimes get asked as you think about conversion funnels and funnel analysis is how this differs from, say, usability testing. Most of our clients are a large enterprise. Most of them will have done significant usability testing. And in usability testing, what they do is they pull people in, maybe people who look like their customers, maybe just people who they pull in from a research firm off the street, and they ask them to sit down and walk through a conversion process. And in a lot of cases, they'll track them very closely while they do this. Sometimes they'll use video cameras. Certainly they'll track their electronic interactions. And they come back with a study that really makes it clear whether there are places in a conversion process that people have a hard time navigating, or the things on the screen people couldn't find. And the way this kind of analysis typically works is that they take someone and they hand them a sheet of paper that says, we want you to do X, and then they put them on the first page of the website and they make them go through and do it. They measure how long it takes, which pages they went to, whether they went through wrong places, how long they had to spend per page, were there places where they got confused and cycled through, were there places where the website didn't appear to work for them. So that's traditional usability analysis, and obviously it's a pretty good way to look at whether your forms are working well or not. So the question is, well, how does behavioral analysis and web analytics supplement what a usability analysis do, or go beyond it? If we're already doing usability analysis, why might we look at people's behavior? And there's a couple questions that I think are important that you really can't answer with traditional usability analysis, and I've tried to call some of those out here. Questions like, are users actually ready for the form process when they land on it? In most websites, you have a certain amount of control over when you drive people into a conversion process. And if you drive people into the conversion process, like right from the home page, sometimes what you find is that people aren't ready to be in the process yet. That's not something you can really test with usability analysis. It's something that requires an actual customer being in an actual customer state of mind. Is additional persuasion necessary as visitors navigate the form to keep them on track? You'll notice exactly the same thing applies here, right? The reason you can't do this in usability analysis is you're just sitting someone down and telling them to go through the process. They don't need any persuasion at all. But in the real world, buyers may decide to drop out. They may forget why they may decide, I don't know if I really want to buy this. There's that or sort of residual uncertainty that can't be measured in usability. But maybe there's things you can do from a behavioral standpoint. Do certain types of visitors behave differently in the form? This is a core segmentation question, and once again, it's something that can't be answered from a usability perspective. Is there site information that might need to be surfaced in the form when used by actual buyers? This gets to the fact that if you sit down in front of a form and you're just told to navigate it, you may never think about, you know, is there something I need to know in this process to get it done? If I'm buying a car, do I need a loan versus buy calculator to decide whether I'm going to lease or loan? Right? If you're just given a task, you'll probably just go through and do whatever the task is. But buyers sometimes have different problems, different needs, different things they want to think about. So again, there are behavioral things that may show up that would never show up in traditional usability testing. Lastly, there are just sort of basic usability questions that sometimes can't be answered by usability testing. A thing like, are there too many fields on a form page? If you sit someone down in front of a form page and say, fill it out, they're going to fill it out, right? It doesn't matter to them how long it takes them. They've been told to do it. You can measure how long it takes, but there may be no difference between a person who sat down and navigate a form that's broken up into 6 separate screens versus one that's one giant screen that maybe stretches this long, if it's task-based, if the person has to do it as part of what you told them. But there may be significant differences in how well those 2 types of forms perform when you actually present them to real users. So there really are reasons why behavioral analysis can tell you things that you can't get out of usability testing. But notice the kinds of questions that I've asked here. They're really things about what happens in the real world as people navigate a form. And so one thing that you probably don't see here, and that I'm going to talk about a fair amount, is sort of the basic idea behind form analysis, which is that all we really look at is how many people move from step to step to step. And that's classic form analysis. What I hope to do is go beyond that to show you how you can start to answer some of the kinds of questions that I put there. So one of the things that I guess this is not so much from an analytic perspective, but almost a preparation for analysis that I think is useful, which is that we deal with a fair number of clients that have lots of different forms on their site. If you have a client that just has one big form on their site, like the conversion funnel, if it's an e-commerce shopping cart checkout kind of thing, you may not be concerned with this. But with a financial services company, it's not unusual for them to have hundreds of different forms on a website. Forms for, authorizing this, forms for transferring funds, forms for doing transactions. Every different type of transaction may have a different forms process. When you think about how to set that up from an implementation standpoint, one challenge you may have is that you can't set aside variables for every form specifically. So one thing I've found useful is to do what a form classification, so that when you set up variables and events, what you're doing is creating a set of variables and events that capture common things that occur in a form, like the step on a form where you got personal information from somebody. That's almost always a critical point, right? Where someone enters their name or phone number, or email address. That may be common across a number of different kinds of form processes. So instead of capturing an event and calling it event 1 of a specific form, what you do is you capture an event that's when they provided personally identified information. What that allows you to do is, across a wide range of different form processes, to set up reporting and analytics so that you can always look at step drop-off, for instance, between providing PII information and completing the form. So in a lot of ways, if you're working in a very form-rich environment, having a kind of classification system, and these are some suggested classifications: users being asked to select a type of operation, users being asked to provide PII information, user is being asked to provide details about the operation, user is being asked to review and confirm, user gets a thank you, right? So these are pretty standard steps, and you may want to tune this a little bit, but this is a way to set up a web analytics implementation so that you can do analysis across lots and lots of different forms fairly effectively. So let's talk about some of the questions and think about how to answer them. So the first question I really surfaced is, are users ready for the form? And it's tricky because there's a sense in which a lot of clients measure the success by how many people get into a form. So if you're looking at a campaign, a lot of times one of the first things people will measure is how many people went from a campaign and started like an application process. But that can lead people to very aggressive navigation. So they start putting big giant buttons on the landing page, sign up now, right? And they can get more and more aggressive about it. Sometimes that leads to negative results. What I think this is one of those cases where it can become self-defeating. At first it looks like your performance is going up, but the more and more aggressive you get about driving people immediately into forms processes, what happens is you start driving people there before they've really been persuaded, and they never get the sales and convincing information they need. So this is something that you can study and you can look at. And really the idea is to look at what people did before they went into the form. So you look at how many pages people viewed prior to form entry, you look at the content classifications people had prior to form entry, and you look at their form navigation behaviors based on that. So can you isolate differences between people who looked at a significant amount of content prior to coming in, people who looked at a little bit of content, and people who looked at no content at all? One of the things that's going to make this very tricky when you do this in the real world is that in most cases you're going to have a range of different visitor types. There's one type of visitor who maybe comes to a form ready to convert, right? If you go out to the Charles Schwab site, there's a link on the home page, sign me up for an account, right? Well, if someone clicks on that link, chances are they're ready to convert, right? They don't need any sales information. So you may want to throw those people out. You may want to look at people who maybe went to the account page first and then went directly into the application process versus people who actually investigated the costs of an account and what gets involved in an account. But it's definitely tricky because you will find a lot of times that there's almost like a little bit of a curve where people who do absolutely, who appear to have done absolutely no preconditioning are often the most successful, because they're the people who came prepared to convert. Then there's maybe a big slump off as people who do a little bit, very little preconditioning get into the form process, and then it starts to curve upward again as people who are more and more engaged with the site become more effective as they go through the form. What you're looking for is a lot of times you'll throw out that first band of people who click directly into the process, but you want to look for, of people who engage some with the site content, where's the sweet spot in terms of when you want to start sending people to the form. So a couple other things to think about with this. If you find that significant differences exist in people traversing through the form based upon their content, you want to measure like the immediate prior pages. That's to help people tune where they might put calls to action, right? If the whole point of this is to drive the website so that you're controlling where calls to action go to get people into the process. And if you can find that there are some areas that don't really score very well, if people go there from those things, you want to remove or deprecate the calls to action on those pages. So that's the kind of thing you're really looking for to answer this kind of question. Is additional persuasion necessary? So a lot of times in form processes, companies have the option of building and baking more sales content actually into the process, but there's always risk to doing that. One of the things is when you've got people who are ready to convert, you don't want to slow the process down, you don't want to distract them, you want to get them through the information as quickly as possible. So part of the trade-off between deciding whether you want to build more content into the forms process is understanding how many people you have that need additional persuasion. So there's a couple things to look at here. One of the things that you might want to do is look at not only where people abandon, but where they go to when they abandon. One of the interesting things that I found is that when people abandon a form process, they don't all exit out of the site. A significant percentage of people will loop back and look at specific content. That's a really powerful cue. So if you isolate the segment of people who abandon a form process but stay on the website and you look at the content they looked at, that's a really good cue for what kind of information maybe needs to flow back into the form. This is also a case where you can think about, are there things that the form process isn't doing very well? Maybe it's not handling shipping costs very well, or maybe it's not letting you know that you need to make a certain decision as you go through this. So for instance, on a site like Charles Schwab, if you found that people as they signed up for an account were going out of the account process and going over to look at information about what's the difference between a Roth IRA and a traditional IRA, right? That might tell you two things. One, maybe people are getting into the account process without having sufficient information. Or two, it may tell you need to move some of that information right into the process so they don't have to go out to the site. Maybe there's not enough explanation within the process about what the difference is and what's unique about a Roth IRA. So looking at where people go when they exit out of form processes is a really interesting and potentially pretty powerful extension on just did they abandon and which step did they abandon from. So I call that directional abandonment, and particularly when it goes out to interesting content on the website. And it won't necessarily be the next step. One of the things that's tricky about this is a lot of times when you're on those form processes, you don't have direct navigational access to the content you're going to be interested in. So a lot of times what you'll do is you'll bomb out to the home page and then navigate through. So what you have to be able to look at is, after they came out of the form process, what was the interesting content that they looked at? But by segmenting those people who abandon and looking at their post-form behavior, you can really get some pretty interesting things about what maybe needs to flow into the form. Okay. I guess one other thing I wanted to make about this bottom bullet point, even modest levels of directional abandonment. Keep in mind, the vast majority of people who bomb out of forms typically leave the website. You're not looking for people who did this 80% of the time. It's not going to show up that way. From an analyst perspective, if you see 10 or 15% of people who come out of a form going to a certain kind of content, that's really, really significant. Even if you see 3 or 4%, it may be significant, because what you should assume is that the majority of people who are doing this aren't going to show you the behavior that's indicative of what they're looking for or need. So it's not something where you need to see, oh gosh, 70% of the people who blew out of this form went and looked at this content. Don't expect that. It's usually a small percentage, but if you can see that there's a significant kind of content that stands out for people who abandon from the form in terms of what they come back and look at, that's often pretty interesting. So segmentation. Are some types of visitors different? This is one of the most powerful techniques you have for actually doing conversion funnel optimization these days, because the bottom line is that almost everybody has looked at step-by-step drop-off for the entire population of their users. They know what steps people drop off. And with almost all of our clients, it's exactly where you expect, right? It's when you fill out PII information, it's when you confirm an order, right? Right before those steps. So there's nothing very interesting about doing that kind of analysis. But a lot of times, if you drill down and you look at particular segments, you'll find that there are distinct differences in how well they're converting in the form. There's a lot of opportunities here. One of the key things that I think I'd point out, for instance, a lot of times retailers are looking to make a decision about whether they should insert like upsells and cross-sells inside a form process, right? If someone's checking out, how much do you want to distract them by offering additional things that they might purchase? There's always trade-offs in doing that. The more you distract them, the more likely it is that they'll bomb out of the whole order and you'll lose the order. You're always creating friction. On the other hand, if you don't distract them, but you engage them and they add something to their cart, that's clearly a flat-out win. So a lot of times what retailers do is they'll run tests and they'll look for, if I add a cross-sell or an upsell into the process, have I actually improved my total conversion value? That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But what's tricky about it, and I think what's potentially interesting, is that if you start segmenting and you look at, for instance, the behavior of people who are regular customers versus first-time customers versus occasional customers, you may find that those segments perform very, very differently in their willingness to upsell and cross-sell. And what that means is that if instead of running the test against the whole population, you ran the test against specific segments within the population, you might be able to significantly improve performance. So to give you a sense of that, you might find that the net of adding a cross-sell into the order is virtually zero. That you get some additional orders, but you get some additional average order value, but you lose some orders. But you might find, if you looked at it more closely, that almost all the orders you're losing are first-time buyers. So if you only put the upsell in for people who weren't first-time buyers, you have a clear net positive. And that's the kind of learning you can get by segmenting the funnel process into individual segments. And I think this is something that almost every forms process that exists on websites that have regular customers or regular customer behavior, there's often real opportunities to segment and improve the performance of the overall form. So for most of our clients, they've gotten to the point where there's very little opportunity to improve form performance across the whole unit of people. But when you start looking at individual populations within that, you may find there are significant opportunities for performance, because that's just not the way people have thought about this optimization. So definitely one of the biggest things I think you can do in trying to do more advanced form analysis is pick common segments, things that you think might really make a difference in terms of the way people are behaving within the form, and repeat all the types of analysis I'm talking about here on each of the types of segment behavior. So it's not just form fallout by segment, it's pre-qualification by segment, type of content they looked at by segment, can you upsell or cross-sell by segment. All of those things are really appropriate. Is there missing information? This is a really hard one to understand a lot of times. What happens here sometimes is that you get informational patterns of abandonment. I suspect we've all started forms where we got on to like the third page and we realized they're asking for some piece of information you don't have in front of you. Maybe it's some account number that you need or some password you don't have. That can be pretty hard to track down. Usually it's going to show up as like high step abandonment. One of the things it may also show up as, though, is people rejoining the process. So in other words, a lot of times what you'll see when you have forms where people are missing a piece of information is that people will abandon on a step and then they'll come back in a subsequent visit to complete the form because they've gone away and gotten the piece of information they need. Now, you might say, well, if people are going away and finding the information they need, what's the big deal? But there's two things about that. One is there's almost always a certain amount of friction that's introduced into the project because of that. So you are going to lose some people if they have to go away and rejoin in a later session. And the second thing is just less satisfying. It's just a less user-friendly experience, right? So a lot of times what people want to do is pre-warn people about the types of information they're going to need before they start the process, so that they don't. That's particularly true if you haven't built things like saving into your form process, so that you know if someone comes back, they're going to have to go all the way back through the form process. That can be very frustrating for people. So if you don't want to make the investment in building a save functionality into it, looking at cases where people looking at the form abandonment case where people stopped a form but then came back in a subsequent session and rejoined it, that's really interesting. And what you can do is segment for the people who did multiple visits with forms and look for the page they dropped off on. What's the most common abandonment point? If there's a significant common abandonment point in that form, you can go in and look at that page of the form. One thing that often breaks down here is there's no information about which field is really causing the problem, right? I mean, sometimes it's obvious, but in fact, in most cases, nothing in the behavior is going to tell you which field it is. Now, a fair number of you may know that there are form abandonment tracking solutions within most web analytics tools. Usually, they're not wired up. And in fact, we've had really negative experiences with the Omniture one. So we almost never recommend it to people. In fact, I don't even think Omniture recommends it anymore, right? So if you are working with a client where you think that form field abandonment is going to be a really critical issue, it can be done. It can be custom wired up. We've done that in a number of cases. Even if we don't use the standard Omniture one, it's actually not very hard for us to write a custom form field abandonment tracker that will flow into the web analytics solution information about what field people were on when they abandoned. A couple cautionary notes about this. It does introduce some significant extra complexity into the implementation. Two, it's not always that interesting. In my experience, what happens is people abandon on the first field or the last field on the form. All you really know is what focus they had when you do that. And you know maybe what field they filled out. But a lot of times people look at the form when they show it, unless it's a really, really long form, in which case they might start down and fill it out. But these days, increasingly, forms are often broken up into fairly discrete chunks. You see the screen full of information. If you see a field on the form that you don't know you don't have the information, you're not going to fill out everything up to there and then stop on that. It's just not the way people work, right? So there's a pretty good chance that the form abandonment information is not going to necessarily point to the field that's causing the problem. This is one that's just tricky, but I guess what I would say about it is be aware, one, that there are implementation solutions that allow you to track down to the form field level if you want. If the client asks for it, make sure you push on it a little bit to find out what they're actually thinking about. It's one of those things that sounds very attractive to clients. If forms are important to them, they'll often tell you, we've got to have form field abandonment. It's not always that useful in actual practice, but if they do need to have it, it can be done, and it can flow through. But a lot of times, for the kind of analysis I'm suggesting here, more than the form field abandonment, looking at people breaking out of the process and rejoining is actually a more powerful way to detect places where people are having to go away and look for information that they don't have. Now, a lot of times you'll find, hey, what if they're not coming back? What if they just won't fill this out? Well, what are you going to do about that? I mean, there's two sides to this. In general, as an analyst, anytime you look at a form, you don't even have to do any analysis on it. If there are things in that form that aren't necessary, you should push back on it. One thing that I always emphasize to people, to clients, is every single thing you ask for introduces friction into a form process. So there's no point asking for things you don't need, right? And one of the biggest positive changes I think we ever made in a form process was for an online internet provider where they were asking people to fill out the username before they actually signed up for the service. And it was a real point of pain because it was hard to find an available username. We said move the username until after you've gotten people through the thank you process and then let them pick. Because what was happening was people would sit there, they would try to find a username. After about 10 times they'd get frustrated and they had significant form friction right there. It was a really simple, powerful, high ROI change to just move that after the end of the process. So two things I would say is, in any important form process, you don't even need to look at the numbers on it. If there are fields that don't need to be done until after the conversion, tell the client to move them after the conversion. If there are fields that don't need to be collected at all, they shouldn't be in the form, right? Minimizing friction on forms is always a good thing. It's just like having faster loading pages, right? The faster a page loads, the better. And so anything you can do to improve page load performance, anything you can do to reduce form size, they're always good things to do. And it's not something I even feel the need to justify verify on a data-driven basis. So that's something to keep in mind about missing information. So that gets us, I guess, to this next question about forms, and this can be a pretty hard one to answer. You know, are there too many fields? I think we've probably all seen forms that just stretch down off the page and have, you know, so many fields on them they seem really daunting. And we've probably also all been through forms processes that seem interminable, where you're going through screen after screen after screen. This is a hard one to analyze, and in some respects, I got to say that sometimes usability and focus group testing might be a better way to say whether you've got too much on a thing. But if you are going to look at this behaviorally, there's a couple things that you should realize. First of all, coming back to the client and saying people spend more time on this page in a form is not very interesting. You know, if it's a big long form page versus a very short page, the fact that people spend more time on it is obvious, right? I mean, you do need to measure that, but it's not really very interesting, nor is it very actionable. Keep in mind that every additional page step adds friction to the process. So one of the things that's really funny about this is a lot of times when an analyst will go through and look at stuff, they'll come back and say, this page has a 40% drop-off, this page has a 5% drop-off. We need to fix the 40% page drop-off. Oftentimes that's exactly the reverse of what's true. The 40% drop-off page is probably the page where they enter PII, or it's maybe the page where they confirm their order. If you have a 5% drop-off page, it may not be doing much work, and maybe you can get rid of that page entirely and move it into something else and get rid of whatever friction that page is introducing. Believe me, it's much, much harder to optimize the pages with very high drop-off than it is to optimize pages with very low drop-off. And the reason for that is pages with very low drop-off are just having friction drop off. They're not losing people because of fundamental things. But pages that have really high drop off are losing people for fundamental things that you can't get around. You have to ask for their name, and you have to ask them to confirm an order. You have to give them the shipping cost. Those are things that's really, really hard to change. Form friction is easiest fixed on the pages with the lowest drop-off. So as an analyst, don't ever focus too much on the pages that look like they have the worst problems. A lot of times those are the least offenders in terms of form drop-off. So one other thing I'll mention about this, two other things I want to talk about here. One is that I always encourage clients that have any kind of significant form processes to capture the errors on the forms. So a lot of times they don't do this. So if someone is submitting the form and getting errors back, there's no record in the web analytics solution. That's a problem. Errors are one of the biggest friction points in any kind of form process, and if you're not tracking them, you're never going to know that. And you can have pretty fundamental errors in your system for a significant number of users and never realize it. That's particularly true these days where a lot of error tracking is client-side. So people may really be getting futzed up on client-side tracking. It never goes back to the server, but someone just can't get a client-side interface to work properly. Nothing will ever show up in the web analytics solution about that. The only cue you might get is either high page abandonment on something or high page time on that page, because you're not getting any tracking about what's happening inside the page. I definitely think that it's worthwhile to set up forms, if they're important forms for a client, so that you track errors generated by client-side interactions. And certainly anytime you get a server-side interaction, if an error is generated, that it flow back into the web analytics solution. That's really something I think is important from an implementation standpoint that gets ignored. You should also be aware that there's a class of products out there that are really designed to sort of take this kind of form process analysis and do it. They're called Customer Experience Management Tools. You'll often hear them abbreviated CEM tools. ClickTail is one, TLeaf is another. Those are probably the two most common that you're going to see out in the marketplace. TLeaf is a high-end solution. A lot of enterprises use it for things like customer support. What it actually allows them to do is collect every single web session they're getting and replay them. So if you call their call center and you say, I couldn't get this done on the website, the call center operative can actually replay the session on the website and see exactly where someone tripped up or what was going on the website. That can be pretty powerful, but TLeaf's also super expensive because it has to save every single website interaction and everything that's going back and forth between the user. So it's a pretty high-tech solution, and it requires a pretty big investment by the client. ClickTail's a little bit different. ClickTail is more of a sampling solution. It's a tag-based solution. You put it on your form pages, and it tracks not only what users did on the form, it even tracks things like what did they scroll and where they moved their mouse. That can be really interesting from an analytics perspective. And so if you've got a client that has really high demands for form tracking, one thing you may want to recommend to them is you've got your web analytics tool, that's all fine, but you might want to put ClickTail on as well. You just put it on the form pages. It's very inexpensive. It typically will only cost clients a few $1,000s a year to do their form tracking, and you'll get really interesting information, things that you're never going to get out of the web analytics tool. Things like, did people scroll down on the form? How far did people get on the form? Where did they move the mouse on the form? That's generally a proxy for like eye tracking, what they were looking at. So if you're really interested in doing sort of more high-end user interface analysis on a form, a tool like ClickTail is really appropriate and goes beyond what you can get out of a web analytics solution. So form abandonment, this is what we typically get asked to do, is, hey, help me with form abandonment. People are leaving my form. And I think I've already made, I think, most of these points, which is that finding the step at the highest drop-off is not particularly interesting and will not facilitate your analysis in any way. Finding the form elements is probably not going to facilitate your analysis. I think I've already talked about the fact that optional form elements should always be placed after the close. So anything you can move after that, you should do. Some common interpretation errors around this. Talked about this already. If a form page has high drop-off, there's something wrong with the form. No. It's just not the case. In fact, a lot of times it's a combination of things. One is you may be sending a lot of crappy people out to the form, right? I mean, if you're landing people from a pay-per-click campaign directly onto a lead form and you have high drop-off, chances are it's not the form's fault, it's the campaign. High drop-off is not necessarily an indication of anything. First and last position are classic drop-off points. There's nothing significant about that. Quality of traffic, massive impact. So don't assume that bad numbers on a form step or a form field indicate any kind of problem. I've already talked about this. Focus should always be on high drop-off points. No, I found a lot of times it shouldn't be. It should be on low drop-off points. Those are a lot of times the easiest to consolidate and get gains. You can tell what a user was thinking by looking at the specific field the user abandoned from. Sometimes that's true, but like I say, 9 times out of 10, when I look at this data, the most common abandoned field is the first field on the form. People looked at the form and didn't fill it out. That's by far and away the most common thing, and it's not that interesting. You should always measure forms using visit-based conversion funnels. Well, I already talked about why this might not always be the case, particularly with forms that are more complex, that are demanding users come up with some unusual information. A lot of times you really have to look at it from a visitor basis. You have to be able to look at, did people come back and rejoin the process? That one will give you a much better sense of how much business you're actually losing out of your form friction. A lot of times I've seen this where it feels like people have really high abandonment rates, but when you actually extend the analysis to visitor basis, the numbers become much, much smaller. That doesn't mean there may not be problems that should be fixed. You may want to get that down to single visit behavior, but it does lessen the impact of the problem. It's one thing to go into a client and say, hey, we're going to improve your form conversion by 35%. It's another to go into the client and say, hey, we're going to improve the percentage of people who can do your form in one step by 35%, right? It has nothing like the same ROI to their business, so it's important to be realistic about what you can accomplish, and part of that is knowing whether the abandonment is real or whether it's just multi-visit abandonment. This last one is a really simple thing. It's not even an analytics thing, and I talked about it in the context of the functional analysis, but when you get people to the thank you page, are you done? No. There's almost always a little bit of thought that you should put in here about what am I going to do when someone finishes this process? What can I take them to next? Where should they go? There's always interesting analysis to be had at what is the right thing to direct people to at this point. And again, this can be segmented. This can use information about navigation patterns. Where do people actually go when they finish this, right? There's a lot of interesting things we can do as behavioral analysts to help guide this, and it's definitely something that's just an easy win a lot of times to give a client something that they can take advantage of to direct people to the right places on the website. Some things to look at in terms of returning behavior. So multi-session behavior can answer a couple questions, one of which I've already talked about. I think I sort of touched on this, but it's also important to know we do frequently get asked by clients, hey, should I build save functionality into my forms? It's a very legitimate question. It takes a fair amount of work to do that from the client's perspective. And certainly one of the keys to that is looking and seeing how many people do actually need multiple visits to do it, right? If it's a tiny percentage, they shouldn't bother, right? If it's a pretty hefty percentage, it may really make sense. The other thing to look at there, though, is, save functionality is useless if all of those multi-session people are abandoning on the first page of the form. right? If you've already structured your form to make it clear on the very first page of the form what piece of information they need that's causing people to go off and come back, then putting in save functionality isn't going to help, right? So understanding where people bomb off is equally important, and sometimes that's something to look at too. If you understand that people block off on the second or third page of the form, you may be able to improve that behavior just by moving that form element up to the first part of the process. Are there information requests? I think we talked about that. Can a funnel be used to track a form? Sometimes you can look at specific funnel behavior, just look at page, and you don't have to set up anything special on the form. And where you can do that, you may not need to do anything extra. Key return behavioral data points include how much multi-session behavior is there, where does the multi-session fallout occur, what form fields were immediately there, and what is the true visitor abandonment rate. I think I've talked about all of those. So just some common patterns here, I guess, from form consolidation and something to look at. I guess I see a lot of forms that fall across both these. The thing is, if you see a very disjointed form in terms of the amount of time it takes on step to step to step, there may be more opportunities to consolidate it. So particularly if the form is collecting information on multiple steps, a lot of times there are real reasons why this is true. People will block the information in ways that seem to make sense for them. It's not a given that every form should look like the right-hand side of this. But in general, if you see form step rates where you can look at, well, there's very little going on step 3 and step 7 over here, that may be opportunities to take that information and flow it into other steps in the form and get rid of that whole step. So these are just common patterns we see and some things to think about when you do that. So I guess that's really the last slide on form function. And I guess I'll just wrap this up and see if there's any questions. But just say, I guess from my standpoint, the idea here is that increasingly these days, if we get asked to do form fallout analysis, it's not going to show the client anything interesting if all we do is come in and show them abandonment from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4. That's what we used to do. That stuff actually worked sometimes 10 years ago, but nowadays clients are just much too sophisticated about what they're doing in terms of usability work, design work. There's been much more standardization about how forms should be built. You're never going to find anything interesting just doing step fallout, but there are a lot of times things you can answer, questions you can answer that maybe even the client hasn't thought of about, are people qualified for the form? Are there segmentations inside the form that are driving behavior? Are there pieces of information we should surface inside the form? So if you start with the right set of questions, you can improve funnel performance, just have to drive the analysis a little bit deeper. So I'll stop there. Questions on advanced funnel analysis as we've discussed it here?